My background is both copyrights. I'm not an attorney. I'm a business person, and archives, film archives, and copyright interests me because it is an influence on what's available for classic films and what's preserved. And that's how I'm going to focus on it, is the economics of the public domain as seen through availability, exclusivity, and pricing power. We're all very familiar from the last couple of speakers about the constitutional basis for copyright. And as originally intentioned, there was a balance between the public benefit and the limited times and protecting authors by the exclusive, granting them the exclusive right to sell copies. Because after all, copyright is the right to copy. The Supreme Court has reviewed many copyright cases, and in the Rear Window case, they addressed why copyright should not go on forever. The copyright term is limited so that the public will not be permanently deprived of the fruits of an artist's labors. More recently, in the Eldred case, the Supreme Court was much more willing to defer to Congress. The Copyright Term Extension Act is rational, and they will not second-guess congressional determinations. Following the Eldred decision, an editorial in the New York Times noted, quote, "In effect, the Supreme Court's decision makes it likely that we are seeing the beginning of the end of public domain and the birth of copyright perpetuity," end quote. So today we'll be looking at the historic roots of public domain and examine some of the economic consequences of works in the public domain. Before the U.S. joined the Berne Convention, every work, such as a film, had to have a copyright notice for protection. So here's a film I'm producing for DVD, and you can see that the copyright notice has three essential elements: the C in a circle, or the word copyright, the year, and the claimant, which is an author or owner. And the purpose of the copyright notice was to inform the potential user that the work had an owner, and the year was there to let you know when the work would fall in the public domain. The failure to have a proper copyright notice proved fatal for the copyright on many American films. Night of the Living Dead was produced in Pittsburgh by director George Romero and his friends, and they formed a small company called Image 10, and then they lined up theatrical distribution in 1968 with Continental Distributing. Continental changed the title to Night of the Living Dead, made up the 35mm prints, but forgot to include the copyright notice. And because of that lack of notice, back in 1968, Night of the Living Dead fell in the public domain. But it wasn't only little independent films that ran into this problem. Here's one of the most popular films in the public domain from 1963. It has a great cast, a great title, and a not-so-great copyright notice. We have the year, 1963, in Roman numerals, the claimant, Universal Pictures Company and Stanley Donen Films, but not the word copyright or the C in a circle. 2 out of 3 isn't good enough, so for the lack of a single word, this film fell in the public domain, although it has plenty of underlying rights. Now, back in the old days, the law was very precise. Not only did the work require the exact copyright notice, but you had to file with the Copyright Office a form, a copy of the work, cast and credits, and a fee. And then many years later, you had to file a renewal, and you had a 1-year window to file a whole nother set of things. And if you didn't follow these procedures exactly, you would lose all of your exclusive rights. Okay, well, I have a quiz question. Who ended up as the richest person in Hollywood during the Golden Age? So was it singer Bing Crosby, Lou Wasserman, one of these actors, directors? Any thoughts? Okay, we got a Bob Hope, we got a Lou Wasserman. Well, I put my money on Gene Autry because he put his money into broadcasting, and in 1982 he sold KTLA for $245 million. And his last appearance on the Forbes magazine 400 list gave him an estimated net worth of $320 million. But my point is that if anybody could afford good legal counsel, it would be Gene Autry. But the rules for copyright renewal were so precise that even wealthy Gene Autry screwed up. So here's his office sent in 10 renewals on the same day in 1977, and the Copyright Office wrote back to Gene Autry Productions, we were able to register 6 of your 10 renewals, the other 4 were too late. And when you do the math, they missed the renewal window by less than a year, even 11 days, and the law was unforgiving. So like the happened with Charade and Night of the Living Dead, the rights holders lost their exclusive right. I'm not taking a position here. I'm just showing how the results before were absolutely catastrophic if you didn't follow a very precise procedure. So before we move on, we'll look at a quick review of the practical effect of these laws. So in the U.S., all American works published in 1922 or earlier are in the public domain. So even though the copyright in this Theta Bara version of Cleopatra was renewed, it's expired. Works from 1923 to 1963, such as Casablanca, are protected for 95 years if they originally qualified for copyright and that copyright was renewed. And then from 64 to 1989, films such as Shaft had to have a copyright notice, but if they did, they get full protection. And from 1989 to the present, no notice is required. And if it seems a bit arbitrary on these years, well, it is, because these dates all depend on when the laws were passed by Congress. And in my work as a consultant, the more Congress wants to confuse the issue, the better off for me. So in 1989, the United States joined the Berne Convention, and it had many improvements over the old process. You don't need a notice. You don't have to file renewals, and you don't have to file with the government unless you want to enforce your copyright, in which case you have to send in the same old stuff that you sent before. You just don't need a notice on the work. And then in 1994, it became even better when we joined the GATT. And suffice it to say that with this, the United States decided it was more important to have American works protected overseas than to have the benefit of lots of public domain works here. So as a result, virtually every foreign work from 1923 to the present is more or less protected by copyright in this country, but there are plenty of American works from that same period that fell in the public domain for a variety of reasons. And while this restoration was automatic, for the foreigners to enforce their rights, they had to, you guessed it, fill out a form, send a fee, and they had a 2-year window to do that. And the impact of this has been, whereas before you would have, that should be 94, not 98, you had dozens of different distributors putting out these foreign films, widely available from multiple companies, and now you have licensed versions. So all the cheap videos of the 39 steps disappeared, and now we have a very expensive version from Criterion. So the concept of copyright has changed from protecting the artists who work for years, in poverty to create their great creation, to protecting artists who work in this type of creative environment. The film industry began at the beginning of the 20th century and grew amazingly fast. And in the early 1920s, the industry established the Motion Picture Association of America, and they hired Will Hayes, who'd been chairman of the Republican National Committee and was Postmaster General under President Warren Harding. And at that time, the Postmaster General was in charge of all the patronage. So he knew everybody. And the film industry was one of the largest industries in the United States, or at least it was telling everyone it was one of the largest industries in the United States. So in 1931, the Film Daily went through the government census of manufacturers and decided that, well, actually, it wasn't quite so big as it said. And depending on how you counted, it was as low as 77th. So we would have no reason to doubt the film industry today when they tell us that intellectual property is America's largest trade export. And the film industry isn't America's largest trade export. But this is only true if you include computer software, which is a copyright industry that's often completely opposed to the interests of the entertainment creators. And in this picture, Valenti is with Representative Mary Bono, who is behind the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, 1988. So let's look at the copyright trends, what's in and what's out. Certainly there's little interest in individual creators unless you're a song publisher who lives off the songs of dead composers. The focus instead is on the rights owners, such as News Corp. We've shifted from limited terms of protection to terms that are, if not in perpetuity, likely to reach Jack Valenti's ideal of perpetuity minus a day. And for me, what's most interesting here is that in return for protecting the most valuable properties forever, there's a new flexibility for less important works. The movie studios and the record companies have acknowledged that their focus is on their classic properties, the key ones, and the merchandising figures, and they really don't care about anything else. But the net of all the term extension and renewal, has swept up everything with it. I thought it would be interesting to look at the legal availability of films on DVD from the major studios, so I looked at every 5 years. And a very small proportion of the materials that they own the rights to are available on DVD. Why don't they release more? Well, part of the reason, surely, is that by limiting the amount of product in the marketplace, they can retain pricing power. So Warner Brothers can sell a DVD of a 1935 film for the same price as a more recent film because they haven't flooded the marketplace with older product. But what about public domain competition? There's one significant difference in the public domain status of moving image material. If you want to put out a book that's in the public domain, you can always go to the library and transcribe the book. Films are held by their producers, and they are under no obligation to give you access. And most film archives are very little assistance either. So the things exist, but if you don't have access to a copy of it, then the fact that it's in the public domain is actually very little use. So with this flexibility, there have been 2 recent changes to the law, because the rights holders recognized that they needed to give way somewhere, particularly following the Eldred case. So last year saw a change to the copyright law to allow libraries and archives to distribute copyrighted films of little commercial value. So if they're not subject to normal commercial exploitation, qualified libraries or archives can distribute that work. But this is so new that no library or archive that I'm aware of has actually done this with moving image material. And the archives that I consult for are absolutely terrified, even though they have, the law is there, but they're so intertwined with these rights holders, with permissions to get their films shown and all that, that they really are uneasy about stepping across that boundary. And the law is written so poorly, and in a very good way. It has holes in it you could drive a truck through. And, library and university attorneys are extremely cautious because it doesn't say you do these 5 things and you're all right. So I'm hoping to be able to get interest maybe from one of the foundations here to actually do a study and to establish some ground rules so that this can go forward. And then the second is that the Copyright Office has taken up the issue of orphan works, works with no traceable owners, and they've had public comments and public roundtables, and this month they'll be submitting recommendations to Congress. And their solution for the use of orphan works is to have a limitation on remedies. So basically, if you put it out and the owner shows up, then all they can collect is $1. It's that sort of thing. But once they've shown up, you have to figure out how concerned you are to continue using it. So for the rest of this, we'll be talking about the effect of a reduced public domain. The pricing power of exclusivity. If you want to produce a documentary that uses footage from Hollywood features, it's very expensive. The budgets for documentaries are a lot lower than they once were, and it can easily cost $10,000 a minute. That's the standard fee for one clip of a copyrighted film. And if you want to use less than a minute, you still pay the $10,000. And yeah, you can cut some deals, and maybe you'll get them down to $5,000 if they really like you, but it's a lot of money. And I use Warner's here because it's a good image, but they'll only license their footage for projects that appear on Turner Classic Movies. And since it's copyrighted material, they aren't obligated to license it for any price. Now, you can license public domain footage from real companies or some guy with a warehouse of prints at very, very low costs, but not a whole lot's in the public domain. Can we go ahead and kill the house lights, please? It turns out that a small industry has built up offering trailers for stock footage under the presumption that they're in the public domain. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but I'll give an example of the type of quality filmmaking which, if is a copyrighted feature and a public domain trailer. We're going to play this? Come on, slowest computer in the world. What do you think? Yeah, I think so too.
Once a normal, voluptuously beautiful woman, she drove into a nightmare of horror and saw descending from the sky a titanic monster whose fearsome touch became a frightful curse. Attack of the 50-foot woman, incredibly huge, with incredible desires for love and vengeance.
Always like to include some moving image footage in presentation. Okay, come on. Yes. All right. I want to talk about pricing, and in this case, talk about the stock photography business, which is all copyrighted material. The stock photo industry faced a crisis a few years ago when some upstart companies started selling stock photos on CD for unlimited use for a flat fee, and this completely undercut their existing pricing model. But they, unlike lots of other industries, were very flexible, and they quickly created a new model for two tiers of product: rights-managed photos, which the buyer has exclusively, and royalty-free, which are also copyrighted but non-exclusive and sold for a flat fee. And images are placed in one of these two categories based on the intended usage. And this is basically a rights-controlled equivalent to public domain material. And this has created some interesting situations where you can go in and you pick out the photos that you want, and then you negotiate a license amount depending on the intended use. So a particular image or campaign, we can find what's called the Everywhere Girl, who buys her computers from Dell and from Gateway and her cameras from Calumet, and she has them shipped by UPS and pays her bills using her Visa card, and she settles her taxes using H&R Block, and she attends Penn State, but things apparently didn't work out, as now she's going to Kutztown University. And she has a part-time job selling campus advertising. But things are looking up as she's taken a year studying in Germany. So she starts working at Siemens and then decides she'd actually rather sell fire suppression systems. Then she goes to work for a bank in the U.S. and finds herself transferred to France. And then her luck turns bad and she's pulled into the laptop that she bought from Dell. And finds herself appearing in Russian language videos. So, with all these career opportunities, which exciting career do you choose? Well, you become an actuary. But seriously, you see the importance of exclusivity and why the ability of a copyright owner to control use is so important. And I was emailing with a friend who works at Getty Images, and she was saying that a couple weeks ago there was a campaign, in an issue of Women's Wear Daily, there were two exact same photos, 3 pages apart in different advertisements. But that's because of the pricing component, that people don't want to pay for the exclusivity. So finally, let's look at the books of Willa Cather, great American author. Her work spans the 1923 copyright line, some published before, some published after. Her books are published by Knopf, and they're available in paperback at these prices. The earlier books are also available from other publishers at much discounted prices, and some of these also have the introductions and other additional material, and all the early books are also available from Project Gutenberg and other sources. And it seems clear that Knopf is making monopoly prices on the later books because there are no competitors. And oddly enough, it doesn't seem to have affected the pricing on their earlier books either. And she sold her novel, A Lost Lady, to the movies in 1925 for a film version, and she so disliked the result that she expressly forbid her publishers from selling movie rights to any of her other books, and saw that the prohibition was written into her will. And it was only because the copyright to the 1913 O Pioneers finally expired was there finally a film version for television. And this production for the Hallmark Hall of Fame starred Jessica Lange and introduced a lot of people to Willa Cather's works. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today, and thank you very much.
Questions?
I'm Isabel Walcott. Do you have any research on, for the works that have gone into the public domain, is there any additional fame or reputation or alternate from financial gain that might have been the result of these works going into the public domain? Do you see what I'm saying? For example, the Willa Cather example, I've read 2 of those novels, and they were both from before they're both the public domain works. So, and to me, those are her 2 most famous novels are ones that have become public domain. Is that just a coincidence? Night of the Living Dead, I've heard of. That other John Barrymore film you showed, I've never heard of it. So, do you know what I'm saying? Is there potentially a benefit from these public domain things that the copyright holders are not recognizing?
Well, it's very dependent by the particular copyright holder. The people at Warner Brothers have both the best library and seem to have absolute fixation on getting the things out there, both with Turner Classic Movies and with their DVD lines. And of those percentages I showed, it's predominantly Warner Brothers. The other companies don't even bother. And part of it is that a company like Sony refuses to sublicense to anybody else, and other companies that do sublicense do at such high fees that only relatively, commercial things can get out there. In terms of the influence, I think if you look back 10 years, 15 years, when there was the colorization debate about should we colorize old movies, and they discovered that actually the problem with the old movies wasn't that they were in black and white, it was that they were old. And since then, there's really been an acceptance of black and white as, acceptable, as authentic, and quite an increase in the use of old footage, or people going out and, taking new footage and then trying to make it look old. So something like the George Clooney film Good Night and Good Luck about Edward R. Murrow, they shot it in color, but they released it in black and white because that's what the 50s looked like in their mind, or at least black and white 50s television. They're the examples of It's a Wonderful Life, and I can come up, if you go through the literature, say the academic literature, it's very clear when something becomes available because it might as well not exist before. And one of the things I've seen through my consulting with various film archives is it's either the laziness of academics or it's the loss of travel funding, and I haven't quite figured out which one, to where people don't go to film archives anymore to look at things when they can just go and buy a DVD of something. So rather than, in the old days when if you wanted to see anything, you had to go to a film archive for it. Now there's so much out there that people just do their research based on what's out there. So I hopefully have kind of danced around your question without giving you a precise answer, but it certainly has had an influence as far as what has a impact on the public.
You said something that I deeply want to have actually be true, so I want to see if you really said it. You said that the industry, the film industry, really only, and the books too, I guess, only want to protect the really big blockbuster stuff, and they don't care very much about everything else. If that's really true, we ought to be able to make a deal that gets us a very long way to where we want to be around the issues that we've been worried about.
It's certainly true of the major movie studios, because there's so much money from those major properties. I mean, how much money is there from Death Comes for the Archbishop? But for those major properties, it's a huge amount of money, and they recognize that, and really the Eldred decision, I think, was that kind of, fearful thing that they were that close to having a public uprising, that they're willing to give way on the things that don't matter to them. And they think that if the archives want to preserve and put out the old stuff, that's not competition for them. They'd still want to keep the business where there is money. I mean, you can make more money selling clips from films than you can from actually distributing the entire film. And, a friend of mine is a contract attorney for the MPAA, and there's definitely a flexibility there. And it showed up in the Orphan Works submissions, where the MPAA is quite open to, because they know what they own. They don't own any orphans. It's those guys over there who own orphan things, and they're just as interested in reusing them as everybody else.
So
and whereas 25 years ago, they wanted a complete wall of copyright with no chips in it. Now they're willing to accept those holes as long as it doesn't affect them in a significant way.
So who's articulating the demand for all those DVDs that aren't getting released that you showed? So your bar graph seems inconsistent with what you just said.
Well, the thing about libraries and archives refers to works that are in their extended term. So it's in like years 76 through 95. So it's only come up to 1930. So there are only 6 licensed copyrighted DVDs from the major companies, which include Animal Crackers with the Marx Brothers. And now that the law is in place, it's possible for pretty much everything else to come out once the archives get over their concern about upsetting the studios.
That was a really valuable presentation. I really appreciated it. I wondered about the Warner Brothers standard price you cited of $10,000 a minute. Is that also shared by other studios?
No, because then that would be price fixing.
Yeah. But could you cite a range then?
Well, I talked to someone who's produced documentaries. She produced the Rita Hayworth documentary for Turner Classic Movies, and it's done documentaries with a budget of about $500,000 an hour. And yeah, that's about the prices they charge. And because I thought it was, before I went to England, it was $5,000 a minute, and it's now up to 10. And the surprise is that the companies aren't particularly interested in building that into a huge business. I mean, they do it, but they aren't really out there actively selling that material. Now, on the other hand, they also give material for free for worthy projects. And if you can get the right person within the company, and once again, oddly enough, Warner Brothers is the nicest company to deal with. You can do quite well. I managed to license an entire feature from Disney, the silent film version of Peter Pan. And the legal staff was extremely pleasant. And, it just took a lot of patience. And their recognition that there was virtually no money to be made in a silent film.
Could you say something about the newsreels and the idea of being a public person? Being a famous person, I mean, whether if one is a very a well-known public personality, if one appears in a newsreel and if you license a clip from the newsreel, that you don't have to pay. You don't have to worry about the estate and the idea of getting permission for the person who appears in the newsreel footage.
I'm not an attorney. I don't have any expertise in that. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
We'll reconvene. So we're reorganizing a couple of our television and film panels after that great presentation by David Pierce. Many of the people whose work we have heard from and cited during this conference, Richard Stallman, Steve Weber, Jim Sawicki, Terry Fisher, and others, imagine in their writings and talks an alternative reality, or several kind of different alternative realities, that are not exactly utopian in the sense that it is nowhere. And these alternative realities are not altogether impossible to achieve or get to either, as we hear about new activities in the UK, in Europe as a whole, in France as an individual country, in Denmark, and in Brazil, where Terry Fisher's latest book covers a tremendous amount of ground. But it is still some alternative place, and I think we need to keep that kind of long-term, distant, optimistic vision certainly in mind. But I do believe that we ourselves can manage to effect change, especially in the way that we move forward in producing media, and especially in the way we move forward producing so-called educational or public media. In 1977, a young professor of architecture at MIT published an essay in the Quarterly Review of Film Studies titled New Possibilities in Film at the University. That author, Ed Pincus, is here in the room today. He went on to launch the MIT Film Studies program with Ricky Leacock and worked with his contemporaries, the Maisels brothers, Frederick Wiseman, D.A. Pennebaker, and others. He trained legions of filmmakers working in our universe today, and he produced with a social and political eye groundbreaking documentaries on subjects as verily painful as the Black South and marriage. Ed wrote in his essay that he, quote, would like to present the meaning for film of the technological breakthroughs some 15 years ago that defined what came to be called cinema verite, and the possibilities that these open for film production at the university. I think that this challenge falls again to us today. It seems to me that what we should do is assemble, perhaps, with the legal, business, production, financial, archival, and consulting sensibilities represented at this meeting, a set of open educational resources that are on video and film. Materials that have an affinity, to use Jim Sawicki's word, with the pedagogical agenda. While we wrestle and struggle and fund the conversion and clearance of previously produced so-called legacy content, perhaps we can focus some more attention on creating and producing new materials today, based at the university, based at the library, based at the museum. Kadi Geber identified Chin as an executive producer, after all, today. Let's build, to use the language loosely, I guess, open source documentary assets for education and culture. I won't quote for you the statistics that about the media use of teenagers today and their excitement to work producing media, but we certainly need to get a handle on it. We need to harness that energy, the creative energy, the collaborative energy, the student and teacher energy, and the excitement of specialists in archiving media in the university and outside of it. To some degree, a number of us are doing this already, building what we at Intelligent Television formerly call open production initiatives. For example, we are spinning key elements off of a major 3-hour program on the Suez Canal crisis that we are producing in association with the BBC, and with resources at Newsfilm Online that David Dawson spoke of, into the BBC Creative Archive for people to rip, mix, and burn. But this project, although it is kind of it's a crucial subject, it's an account of a botched Western invasion of the Middle East exactly 50 years ago, is not something that we essentially control. And the BBC Creative Archive, for now at least, has geographical limits as to its use, restricting that use, by intent if not always in practice, restricting access to its rich base of materials to UK-based users and IP addresses. So what if we were to produce a new documentary as a test? My friend and partner Alex Gibney, who directed Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, The Trials of Henry Kissinger, produced The Blues and the Pacific Century for PBS. He and I are producing a new documentary on the history of the Korean War with historian David Halberstam, whose new book on the subject comes out in 2007. I mean, could you imagine producing this type of film in an open environment? It's a subject that's essential. It could be produced and cleared properly with testimonies from the veterans on all sides of that conflict, with the survivors, with the people from that time, and the reels of footage, many of which are in the public domain, around the world from the war. And if that's too broad for all of us to imagine, then what if we were to fund and produce, using the same power of the camera lens and the microphone and digital technology, educational materials for learning? There are 3 cameras filming this meeting right now robotically through a brilliant, small, and efficient system designed by Craig Milanese and his crew at MIT Video, who will be the first group that we thank at the end of this meeting. The cost of recording and miking this event may amount to $7,000, maybe less, given that I've just plugged MIT Video, the best video production unit. That comes out to about $500 an hour for producing this. And the value of this material that we are taping, I think, is huge. So today, what we will do is hear from producers of educational material in the academy and in public broadcasting. Jay Fialkov is joining us from WGBH on this panel, as opposed to the one after lunch, because he has an engagement and needs to present now. But first, let me introduce Frank Moretti and John Frankfurt from Columbia. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Frank Moretti. I'm the Executive Director of the Columbia Center for New Media Teaching and Learning, and I'd like to begin by inviting you to our conference, which is this Friday. It's at Low Library at Columbia University. If you happen to be in New York or of New York, please feel free to come. It's a full day of demonstrations and presentations by faculty members of the university that have worked with us on different kinds of educational interventions. I'm going to try to give my introduction in Cableese so that we can move quickly to some active demonstrations. My favorite teacher in college was a professor of American Studies who got way behind in his syllabus. And so he got to the last day and he began the class by saying, well, we're up to Melville. The book is Moby Dick. It's a story about a whale. So I'll try to be really quick in introducing what we do. The We're a service organization in the university. We basically partner with faculty, with deans, with program directors, with departmental chairmen in developing either simple interventions like building web courses with faculty, web-based environments for the faculty using the course management system. We do consulting to help people think about how to organize their digital media strategies within the university. And we build web-based applications that are much more serious and elaborate educational interventions. We work with all the schools, all 18 schools. We build simulations with environmental science, heart simulators with the medical school, case studies with people in journalism in the School of International and Public Affairs and social work. We build multimedia publication environments that support a number of different educational programs. And probably some of our most innovative work has been done in building tools like the image annotation tool and the video interaction for teaching and learning environment that John is going to demonstrate for you today. I would direct you to our website as a place where you can actually get access to the vast majority of things we've developed and done. And if, in fact, for some reason it doesn't allow you to get into a particular tool or environment, you should just email us directly and we'll give you access to it. We protect certain things for a variety of reasons that are related to the subject of this conference. We are part of information services at the university, which means that our cousins are the librarians. And so we have a number of projects that are directly in collaboration with the librarians. One of our most recent projects that we're just incubating at the present time is the creation of a multimedia archive of digital resources that's related to the culture and history of Harlem. And we're partnering with a range of internal collaborators, the history department, the oral history group at the university, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, a number of community-based organizations that are providing collections and assets, and with our friend Peter, Intelligent Television. And what our hope is to develop simultaneously a multimedia archive that will have a number of educational expressions, both at the university, K-12 education, a documentary film, perhaps even kiosks that support learning in different kinds of community technology centers. So with that as an introduction, we really want to spend most of our time demonstrating some of the things we do and then probably elaborate on what we're about in the question and answer period. So I present to you Dr. John Frankfurt, a colleague from the center, who will do those demonstrations.
Okay, well, first of all, here is the website that Frank was speaking about, if you're interested to find out more information. We'll also have a bag full of literature and information about the center, and we'll be wandering about, eventually getting our lunch as well, so you can find out more about us in a one-on-one conversation. As Frank mentioned, the online tools that we develop are for classroom use. For faculty that come to us that we begin a conversation with, and they have varying levels of sophistication. We're funded by the university, by grants, on occasion by individuals, and maybe we'll elaborate on that more during the question and answer. The three projects that we're going to be showing now all have a great deal of video content, in keeping with the spirit of the title of this panel, video derived from film, video derived from television. With each of these projects, our challenge, or I think what we were interested in, was not necessarily the collection or the archiving of these materials, but making this media purposeful, in some way purposeful in the classroom. And I think that's in keeping with our main mission and why our emphasis, or why we're here, is more about the use. I think Howard was right talking about usability. And that's something that we're extremely interested in, and that's really where we feel our expertise falls, as opposed to figuring out copyright questions and the like. So we're going to see very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, 3 projects where the usability of the media increases in sophistication, or the level of interactivity increase. The first one I want to show is the film language glossary, which we developed in collaboration with the School of the Arts at Columbia University, specifically with Richard Pena, who is also the program director at Lincoln Center. And Professor Pena teaches an introduction to film studies class, and he uses a variety of clips. He covers a variety of terms, technical, historical, theoretical. So our conversation began with providing a resource for those students that he could integrate into the class, not simply as a link that they could go to, but things that, terms that he could hopefully assign throughout the semester. We began this with Professor Pena about a year ago, and because this is an online environment, we have the advantage of making this more organic as opposed to the traditional print glossary where you might spend 10 years writing it and then finally releasing it with various upgrades. This is more organic. So the first iteration of the glossary had, I think, only 10 terms. This iteration has 69 terms. So the next iteration, hopefully, we hope to double that. You'll see some of the terms that you have available here in the drop-down menu, such as camera movement. Let me log in. And this is a good thing that you're seeing the login. As I mentioned before, this is available for the community at Columbia. If you're off campus, you can't get in unless you talk to us. The terms are written by the faculty members of the Film Studies Department, so they're providing the content, and they're also providing the consultation in terms of what clips they want to make available to the students. So very basically, you'd be reading through a term, getting some sense, in this case, of camera movement, its early development, and then eventually you'd come upon a clip which you could watch in correspondence with that term. The theory, very simply, is that students will better understand the term if they're able to associate a clip with that term. So as you see here, you have the play clip button. You'd click on play clip, and you'd be able to watch it. I won't tell you how it ends, but I think you can figure it out. This is one way to access all the terms through the drop-down menu. The terms are also available in a film term index. As I mentioned, this is a growing resource, so I think there's some letters that are unaccounted for, but we're doing our best to get them all in there. But you'll see a list of all the terms here as well. And this is another way to access it. And this is a theme that I think will come up in the 3 projects that we demo. Different ways to make the resources available to the user, so that if a different instructor or a student comes along, they have different strategies for approaching it. They're not locked into this path and they must go down it in order to find every single resource that they want to use in their research. So for example, you'd find the 180-degree rule. And once again, you find that setup, the term written, and embedded in the term are clips. And just as I was explaining that to better understand the clip, you associate the clip with the term, we also added this additional functionality of commentary, annotated commentary. And you see here a menu very much like a DVD menu. We think there's a culture of use, so people wouldn't be surprised to see this. And you could actually choose to watch the clip on its own terms, or you could watch the clip with annotated commentary. We're going to watch a little bit with the annotated commentary by Professor Pena.
One of the most commonly used and frequently cited rules or practices of classical filmmaking is the 180-degree rule. The 180-degree rule imagines that there's some kind of invisible axis between the camera and the players who are being filmed. The camera will always stay on one side of that axis, and the players will always stay on the other. The belief was if the camera crossed that axis and went to the other side, suddenly people would switch positions. That is, people on the right would now appear on the left, and vice versa. This is a practice that was established probably in Hollywood or in Western Europe sometime in the early part of the 20th century.
Now, you'll notice here there's a checkbox, so if you've heard enough or you don't want to hear anything at all and just want to watch the clip, you can actually toggle off the commentary. And this is not simply if you've only heard enough, but once again, if you're using it in a different context, perhaps you're not teaching the 180-degree term, but you are teaching something about Japanese cinema from this period, you could go to the film glossary and use the clip for that purpose, as opposed to teaching what sometimes is called the golden rule of film production. Likewise, just like there are many ways to find the terms, there's also several different ways you can access the clip. There's a film clip index, and this is where it starts to look more like a library archive. And I should mention that in addition to collaborating with the film department, we're working with the Columbia University Library, particularly the media library. So they're very interested in this project. And you'll find all of the available clips here, which you can search through, ascending or descending by the film title, by the director, by the year is produced, and also if you want to see every single one that has commentary, you could do that as well. Opening the clips, you can see any of them, but also at the bottom of the clip, it can take you back to the term, so it can re-anchor you if you actually went through the film clip index and you want to see the actual term that is associated with. So that's the very quick demonstration of the first tool. The next one I want to show is the autobiography of Malcolm X. This was done in collaboration with Professor Manny Marable of the Center for Contemporary Research in African American Studies, or previously IRIS, Institute for Research in African American Studies. And this was a 3-year project. And this, I want to log in once again. Which was part of a much larger enterprise. Professor Marable received a grant from the Provost's office and the Malcolm X Project. One of the main things was what's going to be, he hopes, the definitive biography of Malcolm X. But in doing that research with his team of researchers, he also decided that he wanted to build an online resource around the autobiography for the class he teaches every year that focuses entirely on the text of the autobiography. The first thing you notice is you have the whole text of the autobiography available to students in the course, from the first chapter all the way to the epilogue and the like. And the way a multimedia study environment works very quickly is you have what we call a spine text, and in the spine text you have these terms which look like hyperlinks, and these links act as annotations around terms, people, places, things, ideas. So I could click on the term Elijah Muhammad, which appears in chapter 14. He appears throughout the text. And then you'd get an annotation about him. These annotations were written by Professor Marable's graduate researchers. Embedded in that annotation, though, you also have multimedia. So here again we return to uses of video. First, we just have slideshows, which were acquired by a team of media researchers. In addition to that, we have archival video as well as oral histories, which I'll get to in a moment. And here's an interview with Elijah Muhammad from CBS News.
The white race is doomed and that they are a race of devils. Do you make any distinction? Are there any good white people? For example, suppose I were to ask you whom you think is the best white man. Is there any such thing?
I let the Bible answer that. He says, no, not one is good.
So, just to give, we have over 400 annotations throughout the autobiography. We're looking at just one right now, and one clip that exists in there. But once again, you have a variety of strategies from which you can access this these materials. So you could go through the entire text, or as the chapters are being assigned to you, you could find those annotations as the annotations are assigned to you. But you could also find all of the multimedia assets in this index that we created. And these have been organized, too, based on the speeches of Malcolm X, the various archival footage that we have, the commentary. We conducted interviews with people who knew Malcolm X during his lifetime, and also scholars on Malcolm X and civil rights, etc. Press clippings, the FBI files. As we know, there's an extensive FBI file on Malcolm X, and the image gallery. Once again, you could sort these based on the date, ascending or descending, the location where the speech was given, the name of the speech, the title, and also the media type of media. In this case, for the Malcolm X speeches, we have audio files and we have video files. So, for example, if you were curious in this environment to see what is the most recent interview that we have on Malcolm X, you would find it here towards the end of his life after his second trip to Africa.
Wherein all the power used to be centered in Europe, it's not centered in Europe anymore. It has divided itself up and is centered in different parts of this earth today. Much of it is in Asia. Much of it is in Africa.
And as I mentioned, in addition, we have this commentary section, and here's where you find interviews that we conducted in the production of this project with either contemporaries of Malcolm X or scholars on him as well. And this becomes almost like an oral history project as well. So, for example, you'd find Ossie Davis, who knew Malcolm X during his lifetime, talking about Malcolm X's role in the civil rights movement.
And reaching out to the civil rights leaders in '64 was expressing his own commitment to struggle and to its people. Malcolm, part of his greatness was that wherever truth was, Malcolm would go there, even if it cut off his own legs. So he wasn't afraid.
So that's another type of media asset. Finally, in this environment, we have this area called the thematic section. And here is where we actually captured class lectures conducted by Professor Marable, the faculty producer of this site, on themes that he's focusing on for his own biography of Malcolm X. And the 4 themes that we captured for this environment is on the assassination, the Haley-X relationship, in terms of who is truly the author, Malcolm X, women and gender, Malcolm X's political thought and legacy. You can open up any of these and see the lecture in its entirety, but you also have an outline. And most significantly, too, once again, the assets that I was briefly highlighting are, again, repurposed. So, for example,
one of the things,
if you went to this point in the lecture where he talks about the actual shooting of Malcolm X, you could also find corresponding images. But the user, in fact, has control over what images they can look at. And so they're creating a narrative alongside the narrative that Professor Marable is teaching about this day.
About a third of the way back in the auditorium, someone says, "Take your hands out of my pocket." The 2 men begin to scuffle. All eyes turn around to the center of the disturbance. The security men who have been positioned throughout the auditorium leave their sites and begin to go toward the site of the conflict.
That's
Malcolm's
a very quick version of it, but the idea is that you go to these things and it's not simply locking you into some certain idea or theory. In this case, Professor Marable's, you should be able to go in there, use this as a type of archive, create new types of knowledge when you're in there, and perhaps use it in many different courses as well, not simply the Malcolm X seminar that Professor Marable teaches. The final thing I want to show is vital. Now, in this case, you have a large repository of video, but the students have the ability to look at that video and quote video segments into their class papers. If you can imagine the traditional way of you quote an article, a sentence or a paragraph, or you quote a book, it's the same principle with the Vital tool. And Vital is being designed to be an extensible tool, meaning that we want it to be used across many classes, and that's already happened. It came out of developmental mathematics. It's being used in counseling. It's being used in sociology. The one I'm going to show you is from a dance course. I'm using it for my own class on avant-garde cinema. So this idea of clipping and quoting and what you should look for in particular clips, we feel is something that can be repurposed across many disciplines. The first thing you notice in the tool is you'll find the digital library. In this case, for the dance studies course taught by Mark Franco, his class is a survey of modern dance in the 20th century, and you'll find all the clips. Once again, you can sort by title, by year, and when you open each clip, this is where you have the ability to actually clip the clip, so to speak, and do prepare for your final paper. The video will upload, and as you watch the video, you notice you have this start time and end time here. Throughout the screening that you're doing in your own individual workspace, we can have the volume down a little bit, you can click on endpoints that you want to have and out points, waiting for those moments that you think are going to be crucial for your own study. For the sake of time, I'm just going to decide that this is what I want. You give it a title, an easy one, Clip 1. But also you have a note card. This is notes because in all likelihood you're taking a variety of clips for your final paper, much like if you're going to the library, you're pulling every single book you can get your hands on related to your paper topic. So you might want to put in some note, use for conclusion or something like that. And hopefully something more extensive than that. I go to the Save selection, and the clip is put into my own personal workspace. And I can continue to do this over and over and over again. I'm going to go to my workspace now to show you what I'm talking about. And if you notice, I've been working on this final paper for a long time. So in order to sort of orient myself and figure out how many clips I can grab, and once again, we have the sorting function, so I can sort and find the most recent clip that I added. And if I wanted to, I could take a look at it to remind myself and also look at the notation that I put in my workspace to see why exactly I grabbed that clip. Here, then, you see the paper that I'm working on, sort of narrow space here. And in fact, what you can do is you can add that section, that clip to your paper. This is the paper, and we have the add button here. My note was add to conclusion. I hit the add, and it goes into my final paper. Final papers, then, will look very much like papers we're accustomed to seeing in a Word document, only in this case, they're going to be the clips as well. I can open a student's paper, and you'll see that. Final paper using the Vital tool. You read throughout, and every once in a while, you'll come across these links. These are the links that this particular student grabbed for her final paper. The professor could read this and see the argument the student's making and then open up that clip and once play the clip off the argument the student is trying to make here. Now, of course, in terms of grades, notations, if there are comments the professor wants to give, there's still some traditional methods to be followed. You print it out, you hand back the grade, or you could email your comments. But most importantly is this ability to quote and add quotations, video quotations throughout the paper. So that's the fast and furious demonstration of a number of tools. So I think now we're going to go on to our next presentation. Thank you.
That's the first of 3 presentations that we have today about moving images in the university. So my hope is that after Jay, we can break for lunch and hear Yochai Benkler from Yale and come back and see some more of this from USC and UC Berkeley.
Hello. How are you? Getting hungry, ready for lunch? I'll try and be brief. I usually cover this in about 2 or 3 hours, but I'll shorten it up. It's been a great pleasure. Again, my name is Jay Fialkov, and I'm Deputy General Counsel at WGBH, which is right across the river. And I really represent a bunch of us from GBH who have some real interest in all the work and this open content discussion. And I'm not alone here. There are sprinkled throughout other representatives, including, I see Sue Kantrowitz, our General Counsel, David Leroff, our Vice President of Technology. So there are others here who I am speaking for. Just to also give you some brief background of my frame of reference, you know, I'm I think I may be, I'm not sure if I'm the only lawyer who's been on the panels, but I am an entertainment lawyer. I've been practicing now for about 25 years, for 15 years in private practice in Boston, doing mostly music business work, representing rock bands, some of the cool bands from the 1980s whose names you may no longer remember, a group called Fish, whose name you probably do recognize, and I worked for a guy named Maurice Starr, who was the manager and producer of New Kids on the Block. So my background is as an entertainment lawyer representing artists who create rights, who create works that have value, and we're, it's my job to help, protect that value and to give it the full benefit. Thankfully, I was able to join WGBH about 10 years ago, where it's the perfect place in terms of trying to create the highest quality of programming and to distribute it widely, as broadly as possible. So for those of you who are not familiar with GBH, I'll just say quickly, and I don't have a slideshow. I'm just going to share some of my thoughts and observations, but you should know that on the GBH website there's lots of cool and interesting stuff, and I urge you to go there. But GBH is Boston's public television station broadcaster, television and radio, and we're the producer of about a third of PBS primetime programming. So we produce national series like Frontline, American Experience, Nova, Masterpiece Theater, Antiques Roadshow, children's programs like Arthur. So we create, what we think is valuable and useful content under a variety of arrangements. And again, to the extent that our goal is to produce this great stuff and distribute it widely, that's consistent in many ways with the mission of this open content discussion. And we recognize, as some have suggested, that there is a legitimate business model in sharing some of our work for free. So, for example, we distribute our television programs for free on public television, and our internet website, GBH, produces, I'm not sure what percent, a substantial percent of the materials on pbs.org, which is one of the most visited websites, and that's available for free. It's not open in the purest sense where people can maybe take everything they want from it and download it and change it and use it elsewhere, but it's open to some degree. We've been researching and developing for several years a project called Teacher's Domain, which is intended to create materials from the documentaries that we've produced and tailor them for use by teachers in their classrooms, to find segments that conform to the educational requirements of each state. And so it's a matter of using materials and reusing them for positive purposes. But, I can tell you the effort to get all the rights and all the underlying materials to use in that way is extremely difficult. And so it reduces what's available for use in that sort of derivative context. And we have, in the area of free distribution, a WGBH forum network, which works together with partners such as MIT and would record conferences like this, and maybe even this one, for free distribution on our forum network internet site. So we're aware of the benefits of open distribution, and we're also aware, as everyone is, in the changes in the media landscape that are affecting how people are looking to receive what we know as television, and who knows for sure what that will be in the future. We're entering an on-demand environment where people are expecting to get access to the material on their cell phone, on the road, as compared to the traditional television rights, which public television producers would have been concerned about obtaining. And so we watch with interest what's going on with the Creative Commons and Larry Lessig and the BBC Creative Archives with Paul Gerhardt. And we share all of these concerns about open content, but I'm here to say that it's not so easy. We live in a real world that presents some major obstacles to our pure open content. And I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, only to help us understand the challenges that we face. Now, some speakers, I wasn't able to hear all of the speakers over the last 2 days, but thankfully I heard some, and I can't tell you how impressed I am by how smart everybody seems. But some of the speakers describe this open content as an ethical commandment, a human right, something that that involves the nobility of our souls. I think those are direct quotes from things we've heard yesterday. And we like to think at WGBH that we also are fighting the good fight in terms of getting the rights to use this. But these speakers may have only mentioned in passing the obstacles. John Walensky, in his, I thought, great lunchtime talk yesterday, among other, comments, suggested provocatively that if we build it, the money will come. If we create an environment that has open content and valuable content that will help enhance the value of our name and our reputation, and in the end, money will follow. And that may work in some circumstances. This is the sort of field of dreams business model, where if you build it, they will come. But for us, we need money to build the field. We need money to produce the programs. We need money up front to acquire the rights. And so that's, a business model doesn't work. We need shoeless judge, learned hand, walking out of the corn stalks, out of left field, to transform the system. Some other copyright old timer. It's a lawyer joke, not a useful one. But anyway, but we need, we need some magic to happen in order for that to help us immediately. And then Eric von Hippel, again, also I thought just a wonderful presentation, and he spoke about the possibilities of the information commons. And I agree, it sounds like great fun, the information commons. And he left us with a warning, and he talked about a situation, and it's a great story, where the French chefs have developed among themselves customs about how their appearances or materials or recipes can be used, and that you need to abide by these customs. And so that story of the French chefs was intended to give us a sense of all of our troubles. And, with all due respect, and we're the home of Julia Child, the French chefs are the least of our problems, okay? Their invisible fences, okay, are down the road. What we have are visible fences that confront us on a daily basis in order to acquire the rights that are consistent with this notion of open content. So let's look at the fences over this information commons. We have contracts that are in place. We have contracts with distributors, for example, most obviously GBH with PBS, which gives us funding for some of our programs and expects to get in return certain exclusive distribution rights, such as home video or DVD, which is part of the business model under which PBS earns money to survive. So those contracts impose some restrictions, just as, for example, a co-production that we might do for Frontline with the BBC, under which they might get rights in exchange for their contribution of certain funding, rights in their territory for certain distributions. So we have contracts with funders who expect to get certain things in return. Some of our projects, one of our wonderful series that was just aired over the last month called RX for Survival. I don't know if you saw it, but about global health, and that was funded under an arrangement in which an outside funder was involved, and they have their own business model for reaping return on the strategy. And so these contracts, as they relate all along the way, these are fences that stand in the way of pure open content. And then we have the copyright fence. Now, we represent artists. We at WGBH, we respect the rights of copyright holders. That's part of the world we live in. And we understand how copyright is intended to sort of balance the interests between, on the one hand, the author, by providing an economic incentive to create, to encourage creation, and on the other hand, to serve the public interest, to promote dissemination of that work. And so the copyright law, we spend our days living with the copyright law. It balances the dual purposes of creation and dissemination. How does that balance work in a new environment where everybody seems to be a user, and a reuser, and an author, and a distributor? The world has changed. But if you look at a particular program, just to enter real life, an American Experience program, documentary for one of our great series, think about all the copyrighted elements that are in a program like that. Photographs, okay, music. When we talk about the dreaded music, we say songs and recordings, makes your life twice as difficult. Film footage, which may include all of these individual copyright elements. And in order to get the rights to distribute a program, you have to get the rights in all of those elements. And so it's not easy. It's a nice ideal. More and more, we are, confronting the realities of a future where you need the right to distribute the programs we produce as broadly as possible. Television no longer cuts it. We need all these new media rights. And so we're trying to define, and we've worked to come up with a new definition that could be used to define all of these broad distribution rights we need. Now, in theory, it's a simple thing, but when you have a production assistant talking to a representative of music publisher who grants rights based on specific fees for specific uses, you're coming up with a list that sounds like, worldwide television, internet, video, DVD, VOD, on-demand, non-theatrical, educational, audiovisual, international, print, digital, multicast, webcast, podcast, vodcast. It's changing every day, okay? All of which have a fee attached, okay? So the notion of pure unlimited open content confronts some difficulties in the area of copyright. And by the way, I think it raises some risks, because to the extent that people demand of us to produce program that is distributable to everybody for free without restriction, then there's the risk that we're not producing the program that needs to be produced. It would be a shame, for example, if our American experiences can no longer include archival music from the period that they're describing, okay? Because we can't afford to get the rights, okay? That can't be progress, okay? We can accept that the world will change and that there may, over time, be new forms of programming materials distributed in new ways. Perhaps television will be transformed just like music. They're now selling singles again. Maybe they'll be the television equivalent of singles that'll be transferred. But if anything, it would be a balance, a complement to the work that we already do, which I think, would be missed. How much time do I have? 4 minutes. Okay. In the interest of full disclosure, I should let you know that the copyright law does have certain provisions that address specifically the interests of public broadcasters. These are the provisions in the copyright law that no one else reads, and which I've learned are really the most important provisions in the copyright law. But they set aside certain specific limitations on the rights of copyright owners that are intended to serve the public policy purpose of the copyright law, which is to benefit public broadcasting. But these are provisions that have been in place since the law was passed in 1976, and they no longer serve their original purpose. For example, there are provisions that say we do not need to obtain the rights from the owners of copyrights in sound recordings or musical compositions to use those in our public television programs, in the materials that we transmit. And that's great. But the reality is that automatic right, that compulsory license under the copyright law, does not cover some other uses which are standard part of our business practice in order to fund our productions. For example, video DVD sales. Okay? That's part of our funding mechanism. We get funding from corporate underwriters, always difficult, from foundations, always appreciated. But we need to come up with our funding situations to make that work. So it doesn't cover. So we're working with the Berkman Center in a project that's aimed at determining whether the copyright law as it currently exists meets the needs, okay, of public broadcasters and others appropriate special interest groups. And I think we'll find that changes are in order. And while this perhaps seems like a small battle on the open content crusade, this is stuff that may have real value in impacting our lives. Two last things. First, again, the goal from our point of view is consistent with, I think, most everyone's here, which is to create great works that can be distributed and used in their most productive way. The trick for us is to come up with a sustainable business model that allows for the funding to obtain those rights, or a system under which those rights are granted at a reasonable, predictable cost. And in the meantime, we just fight the fight, on a daily basis to do what we can to get, what is my favorite line of poetry. All rights in all media now known or hereafter developed worldwide in perpetuity. I mean, those are the rights we're looking for. And if I get them, I'm happy to use them. Finally, in terms of suggestions, because Peter asked me to say a couple of suggestions, besides possible changes to the copyright law, and I'm sorry for blowing through this all so quickly. I appreciate your holding your attention. Besides the hope also for possible new funding models, $100 million goes a long way if anybody has. But this is what's allowed the BBC to pursue their creative archives with a funding system that allows for it. And so, who knows? I would ask that when we consider open content, we do so with an open mind, in the sense that we might have to recognize that the real world requires a solution in which some of it is open all the way and some of it may not be. And we should find the balance that allows for both. And finally, I would suggest that when we have these conferences like this, which I think has just been great for me as an observer to learn, and hopefully for somebody to teach me something afterwards. But it would be, I think, a good idea to bring in other rights holders, the organizations that represent the copyright holders, whether it be in music or other areas, because they're the first barrier in terms of, for us, doing some of the things we want to do. So they should be part of the conversation and I think part of the solution. So thank you very much. Okay.
Hi. Question for the Columbia folks. My assumption is that particularly for things like the film clips that you have there, that you have some kind of limited license to use those on the Columbia campus for certain purposes, right? I mean, you can't give me a password for NYU to use that, right? Right.
John doesn't want to answer that question. But basically, the way that we work with fair use at the university is the more egregious the potential danger, the more we restrict access. So it's very possible that with some of the environments we develop, we restrict them to use only by a particular class. If I have a colleague in another university that wants to look at something or to use it for instructional purposes, I've been told that there are occasions where I can grandfather them into the research group that's working on developing assessment of these different things, because many of these things are grant supported. The focus of the center is very different. It basically is focused on the notion that the open content and storage and access to information are all things we are committed to, just as you are. But we also believe that digital media is an opportunity to really reinvent education. And so there has to be very aggressive experimentation in creating models of possibilities. I mean, we showed you just a couple of small snippets of things, but there are many, many different approaches we're using that focus much more on what is it that a student could do in a digital context that they would never have been able to do before. Just the way in the 16th and 17th and 18th century people struggled to create new pedagogies and new modalities of education, we have just begun to scratch the surface of what the new possibilities are that really will sit on top of the open access to content that we think is also a sine qua non of what's possible in the future.
And I would imagine then that you end up bumping up against stuff all the time that are inhibitors in certain types of cases, like the student who writes a paper and incorporates the clips in the paper, and then 2 years later is applying for a PhD program and needs to use that paper, or applying for a job, and particularly 5 or 10 years later, you probably can't give that student access to all of this over a really long time, or you're going to bump up against.
Well, it's not black and white. We showed you things that were interesting, that were in the cultural domain, where all the problems you're pointing at really are resident. But we use the same technologies in areas where we own all the content. A lot of the interviews that we did in conjunction with Malcolm X, or observation of children solving mathematical problems, or different kinds of psychotherapeutic interactions that we've staged in some cases. We've captured dramatic performances where we've gotten agreements ahead of time with the Royal Shakespeare Company for limited contained use within the university orbit. So there's a range of content that you have to look at each object and each environment. But all the problems you're pointing to are resident. And basically our posture is that we want to understand more deeply how to do things. And if we're not able to experiment more freely within a controlled environment, then we feel like we'll be restricted in our ability to learn.
For WGBH, and not just for you, but for others in the room, or from public broadcasting for that matter. I'm Rich Weinfield from KQED. It occurs to me, and I'd like your reaction to this, it occurs to me that one of the problems the public broadcasting has in terms of taking its content into an open environment, as compared with our colleagues in the university environment, is that we lack not only the impediments that you talked about, we have all those impediments, but we also lack, I think, a certain level of passion in terms of wanting to actually do that in the first place. What I've learned over the last day and a half is that people in academia, when you're talking about the creation of knowledge and getting that knowledge out, and that if it doesn't get out, in a way it doesn't exist, I mean, I can't think of much more of a perfect mission than that. I mean, you've got to do that. I don't think we've figured out in public broadcasting yet why we should take a great program like American Experience and put it into an open environment of some kind. Because I don't think we've answered that question, but if you have, I'd love to hear the answer, because I haven't figured it out yet.
Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I do think, honestly, that a lot of folks at GBH are motivated by the passion to get this stuff out there, and sometimes they don't confront issues that are simply impractical. For American Experience, for example, the notion of paying to clear all the rights, that's something we're figuring out now, what the added costs will be in order to get a broader set of distribution rights than has been customary. But it's unaffordable. So it's not a current question. We do, though, for example, stream our frontlines online because they don't have the same amount of archival material that makes clearances. And so with Frontline, whenever possible, we do stream it online, occasionally with gaps because, for example, NBC, as one source, doesn't allow in its licenses use on the Internet. So that's one obstacle. So I think that we are distributing a lot of it, and I think we're exploring currently, honestly, right now, what are the rights implications and costs in order to further that. If I could just take advantage while I'm talking, one thing I did forget to mention, not to make our life more complicated than it is, but when I identified other rights organizations, for example, as representatives of copyright holders, to attend and to be involved in this conversation, there are other fences that I forgot to mention. And for example, as a producer, we have agreements with national talent unions and guilds that impose restrictions on how our materials can be used. And so I don't want to forget to mention that that's an additional complication that we confront. I'm sure there may even have been others I forgot to mention. Yes?
Can I add something to that?
And does anyone in GBH else want to comment?
Jeff, can I add something to that? I think it may be the case that if we were more systematically to produce projects in association with universities, I speak as an independent producer, there are at least 3 of them in the room. There are a whole lot more. There are 200, 300 producing some of the finest intellectual property in the world today that operate in this public broadcasting sphere. That passion would be sure to be in our projects. Not only would that passion be sure to be there, as it is in the thing that we're doing with Frank and on Harlem, and you'll hear more about some others, but so too would the archival sensibility that may be required. So too would some of the mind power that Howard represents from NYU and Stanford. So too would a lot of the strength in this room. So it may be that the funding models in the future should involve kind of institutional collaboration, kind of more deeply than they've done to date.
And further answer to your question, the passion is balanced by a business model so that open distribution might not be consistent with, for example, selling of videos or DVDs that allows for a recoupment of production funding. So that might remove some people's passion. Yeah.
Jay, if I could just add, I'm Annie Bell with WGBH Interactive, and Richard, appreciate your comment greatly. It's all about the passion, because it's not all about the money. We don't exist if we can't continue to go across multiple platforms. And I think at WGBH, we specifically pride ourselves for 35, 40 years on the unique way we mix technology with editorial models. Because we're non-commercial, it gives us the opportunity to create, as one of your the panelists, I'm sorry, I came in late, so I don't know all your names, your point about new pedagogical models, your point about being the change in understanding where this is all going. For years at GBH, we refer to that as broadband. It's not just a big pipe. It's the color we have not yet seen. And so we like creating new content models because we're in a position to play with navigable video. Video is a navigation device. What we learn in one platform, transferable to the other. And so I would say that it's what we're all about, whether it's the first to put cooking on TV. People thought we were crazy. The first to put tennis on TV, and now we're doing that across multiple platforms. So we would really, really like your input on what you would like to experiment from an editorially driven technological advantage point of view. So, yeah, here, let's do it.
On the issue of passion, I mean, I think that it may seem like passion, but I think there's another factor that we haven't talked about much here in the way that technology has changed locality and audience. And so the academic community traditionally, without the technology, has had more of a closed, captive audience, whereas the public broadcasting has been in the public world from its inception. So some of the things that the academic environment, as it starts to make its resources available to the world, it's entering into a new domain of it's always been available to the world, but restricted by geography, people having to come to the location in many cases. So that the net has widened that in an extreme way very, very quickly. And so public broadcasting has more experience with that sort of broader kind of issue. Public broadcasting sees it now in the nature of the way you all compete with each other in a way that in the early days wouldn't have been as strong, and that's increasing as these barriers break down. So we're seeing changing environments, territories, however you want to call them, in terms of the commercial opportunities.
If that's right, we'll let this be the last question.
Last question again? Okay. Just to follow up on Howard's question about whether NYU could access the Columbia content, and this is quite interesting going back to the public broadcasting issues, because in public broadcasting, to the extent that we feel an obligation to make content universally available, or to no one, because we don't have the rights to do it, you are, from my perspective, quite daring in pushing the edges of what constitutes fair use, but can't get over to NYU downtown because you believe that the rights that you have wouldn't permit that use by Howard's folks on the other end of Manhattan. Could you talk just a little bit more about your interpretation of fair use to a particular class of users? Because that's very provocative. Suppose we were to say we're going to restrict access to some content only to a particular class of users, how we determine how we do that and what the
Well, I'm not
are.
using the word class in a very legalistic way. I mean literally, John is teaching the history of film.
Yeah.
That is a class. And I wasn't suggesting that I had derived some new definitions for the legal struggle about exactly what constitutes a differentiated audience. No, We're talking about you put these people in the same room, they take a course, they pay. That's a class. That's the minimal restriction. That's the tightest kind of restriction we impose.
This is very useful.
And that is all calibrated. We can basically toggle the environments so that different levels of authorization, the system manages the authorization. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Okay. Sorry, last question plus one. This is actually allowed under the Teach Act of 2002 for this kind of limited distribution to people who are enrolled in a class, as long as it's a nonprofit educational institution. And UCLA and a number of other organizations are doing it also. The material has to be legally acquired, so you can't rip it from a DVD. But if it's legally acquired and it's limited to the people enrolled in a class, then you're free and clear. You'd have to look at the law and see how they define it. But as such things go, it's not bad.
I just wanted to offer one more comment, because I've heard something mentioned a couple of times over the last couple of days. Eyes on the Prize was mentioned as a great documentary series that's no longer available, and that's an example through the hard work of the producers. We're working together with them so that program will air on PBS as an American Experience in the fall, but it's a situation where, as a practical matter, there was enough money raised to obtain public television rights and certain educational rights, but not enough money raised to clear the video distribution, for example, because there's lots of archival elements in music. And so this is one of those situations where you get what you can get. You do the best you can. We have a goal of open content, and in the meantime, we try and produce great stuff and deliver it as widely as possible, with possible being, still an important phrase.
Thanks very much. Oh. So we should spend 5 minutes getting our sandwiches and coming back in, because we're in for a treat. Thank you. I invite you to